So ending about 9 days ago, I just finished a big series where I showed off in detail all of the aspects of the 9 new elite specializations coming with Path of Fire. The player base got to experience those preemptively for 48 hours, and during those 48 hours, I logged onto each one, tried to get a basic understanding of it, and presented all the traits, all the skills, and so on. That was a really difficult job as well, considering the breadth of some of these new elite specs, like the Weaver and the Soulbeast, that had a ton of new abilities. But with all of that done, there was obviously a huge amount to be said, and a huge amount to be responded to. I wanted to take a moment now at the end of that series, after a huge amount of feedback has come in, on some extra synergies, some extra capabilities, and mistakes even that I made from those original 9 videos to round out that series. So I'm going to talk in a bit of detail now on each of the 9 again. Now I'm going into this video with the same general philosophy as I had before, which is that you're not going to see super major meaningful balance feedback here. I think most of that important stuff has already been divulged, and by people who got to dedicate all 48 hours onto one of the 9. And also, I'm not going to try and pin down again like specific metas and how things will go, because I think that's also transient and it will change very quickly. You know, even after the very first balance patch after POF comes out, a lot of weird little things might end up changing. But so let's do it. I do think this is important to do, and there's a lot of fun stuff going on. Let's do it, I guess, this time in order of light, then medium, then heavy, right? So we'll start again with the Weaver. There's not too much extra for all of the new abilities and awesome stuff that's coming with the Weaver. There's not too much extra stuff that I wanted to add on this one, but there was a very big comment that I made, at least just to start us off, to do with traits like Stone Heart. So non-elementalists might not know what this is. It's an Earth specialization trait. It's not anything really to do with the Weaver, except the fact it exists on the same class as the Weaver. And what it means is when you're in Earth attunement, you will be immune to critical hits. And I talked about in the initial video how that interaction doesn't actually work with Weaver, because you can be half in Earth and then half in Fire, but you won't get Stone Hearts. And now just to clarify what I said there, because I think I did confuse some people, the trait does still work, and you can still get benefit from it, but you have to be primarily Earth attunement, and it's not just enough to be half Earth attunement. So we will eventually, sometimes while playing as a Weaver, be Earth attunement main hand. So that's when you get, say, if you're on a scepter, your shards of Earth that come firing out, and you get the 2 that becomes the barrier that then becomes more shards if you want. You get the little dust tornado. If you have those abilities on your bar while you're a Weaver, that means you are main Earth attunement. You are main hand Earth attunement. It is your primary attunement. And in those situations, you will still get the benefit of Stone Heart. And the same is true for any other trait that exists on core elementalists that's like that. For example, in water, where you get Soothing Mist while you're in water. So it will still proc, and you can still do some clever stuff. For example, I can be on a staff with a super glass build, and I can be Earth main, Fire secondary, and I can have access to Meteor Shower, and I can cover my casting of that Meteor Shower while being immune to critical hits. There are those synergies possible. That stuff is there. It's just not as strong as you might initially be led to believe when you first turn Weaver on. So that is a big thing. Another thing I never mentioned related to this was to do with glyphs. I think I never mentioned it in the actual video. But you'll recall that Elementalist has glyphs. Then these give an effect based on the attunement that you're in. Well, what about when we're on Weaver and we have 2 attunements at once? Well, it's the same thing. It's main hand only. This I actually lament more than the loss of traits like Stoneheart not being fully, you know, hooking into Weaver. I do think stuff like Stoneheart would be too strong if it worked whether you were primary or secondary. But for glyphs, when I look at the glyphs, I think this could have been a really fun interaction for Weaver, because elementalists often don't use glyphs that much. Quite often, like, if we're picking the elite glyph, we're picking it because it's sort of a last resort and there's nothing else that we're really interested in for that context of that build, and it's just an extra little summon that we can run around with. But if this worked with Weaver, right, the elemental glyph is, depending on attunement, summon an ally. If it worked fully with Weaver, you could summon like an earth and a water elemental together at the same time, and then it would feel a lot more fitting of an elite, which I've always felt like it's kind of a lackluster elite. Same with the minor one, same with, if you think about Weaver and its condition damage slanting, At least it's got some slanting. At the very least, it's, you know, a hybrid power Condi spec. I think we can all agree on this. Well, you've got Glyph of Elemental Power, which is very similar to one of the Weaver stances. It would be cool if when I pop Glyph of Elemental Power, it basically looks at both attunements at once. But if I'm pure, I don't get double of the effect like the Weaver utility skill itself. What about the heal? You might think, WP, that's crazy. You shouldn't be able to get 2 heals. Well, that's fine. That wouldn't actually happen. If you look at the phrasing of the heal glyph, it is give yourself regeneration or protection or swiftness or regen, and it would just be getting the 2 boons at once. And I think that would totally work too. So the glyphs I do lament more, but again, I kind of understand it. So I want to talk as well about a couple of other little things I missed about Weaver that are just interesting about the spec that make it even more ludicrous than I've previously shown and demonstrated. I've been talking a lot recently on streams I've been doing ever since really I got my first hands on with Weaver, that it was an elite specialization that has around 40 new skills. And that number I came to with some very quick napkin maths when I'd first experienced it. And I actually came up with a couple of different numbers just on what I guessed it would be without working out 100%. And I went for a conservative one, right, which was 40 skills, which still is incredibly impressive. Well, here's another thing about the Weaver. If you really want to get picky about it and you really want to sell people on Weaver, you might have noticed this, that the Weaver auto attacks on Sword, they're not the same as auto attacks on other Elementalist weapons. So to fully understand this, we have to look at LE design a little bit. Elementalist, obviously, any one weapon it got, it actually, over other classes, gained 4 times the amount of abilities because it had a different version for every attunement. And to compensate from that, back in 2012, what ArenaNet did was they said, okay, the Elementalist auto attacks will never be auto attack chains. So if you think of any LE weapon, except the Conjure weapons, which function differently, but any actual LE weapon, they never had auto attack chains, right? Like, so if you're spamming your Fire Dagger 1, it will just keep doing the same thing, or your Water 1, or your Staff Auto. No, they were never chains. Other classes get, you know, if you're an axe or warrior wielding a main hand axe, you strike and then you double strike and then you triple chop, I think is how it goes. That kind of stuff doesn't exist on LE, and that's a counterbalance because of the attunement. I mentioned when I was presenting Weaver to you guys that I would have expected them to be conservative, but no, they added us a sword. We get 3 unique abilities per attunement, and they even had time in this expansion to put all of those auto attacks as chains too. All of the autos from Weaver are chains, and that's another like extra thing. I think if you add everything together, I've seen someone say it's like 64 skills, or maybe it's even higher than that. I mean, we're getting a bit picky when we declare each individual part and component of an auto attack chain as a separate ability, but for the funsies, it's something you can think about. One other thing as well, I wish I'd mentioned in the video, we had a big core balance patch recently where the devs made some changes to Arcane, and I talked a little bit in the Weaver video, the presentation, about how Weaver seems like a great match for Arcane, because Arcane drops the duration of your internal cooldowns on your attunement swapping. Arcane's got like some synergies there. Well, one of the things the core balance patch did too, and it's so obvious now that Weaver's coming, why they did it, they changed one of the traits, which previously just gave you a full damage effect, which was boring. They did this on a lot of the classes in the big balance patch. They actually added to that heal on swap. And you can see why they've done that, because now that's that extra supplement to allowing these Weavers to be a bit more bruisery, to be a bit more defensive in the face of gaining that barrier on their dual attacks, and also, you know, getting a bit of healing every time they attunement swap, which they're going to be doing very frequently. And in fact, I'll add, despite all of the devs' intentions, obviously, to put a lot of damage and stuff on it, they've also put a lot on the Weaver that allows it to stay in melee and sustain in melee. And it's funny because from what I've seen in the community, and particularly some top PvPers, it strikes me that this is actually a lot more defensive of a spec than I first gave it credit for, just because of some of its very high power cooldowns, like the Water 2 on Sword, and it's surviving a lot of stuff that even the Tempest, who was quite durable themselves, very support-oriented, even the Tempest wasn't able to. So it's not all damage on the Weaver. It seems that in some context, it's actually a very sustainy elite spec too. And we get into some weird territory there of is there any real purity to what this thing's doing at that point, but I won't go into those discussions just yet. So that's all cool stuff. There are, each time I talk about one of the specs in today's video, I want to talk a little bit about some not cool stuff, some community reaction as well. Let's not oversell them, and especially after people got to play this stuff a little bit. While I think 48 hours is nowhere near enough time to have any real understanding, and basically every opinion you read out there you need to take with a grain of salt, I do think we can identify bad things about the Elite specs. So what didn't the community like about Weaver? Well, something that I predicted a long time ago, actually, before the 48-hour window opened. I saw it coming a mile off, but when you actually get your hands on with the Weaver, I think a lot of people were shocked about the global cooldown on attunement swapping, which wasn't there or so pronounced on regular Elementalists. And I did say earlier, I think that people will be shocked by this, and I think a lot of people have noticed that now. They're saying it feels clunkier than they expected, especially the idea of having to double attune to get back to our original weapons. A lot of people don't seem to embrace at all as a design functionality. They just view it as an aberration, and I've seen all kinds of suggestions from the community saying, let's get an F5 that allow us to double dip in, and people not liking the idea of having to take a utility skill unravel in order to do that. Now, I actually all like that in terms of design, and I think it's just people finding that the Weaver playstyle is a bit alien to them and thinking it's a deficiency with the Elite Specialization itself rather than a difference in the way we play, but we'll see whether the devs end up listening to that. We kind of had similar discussions 2 years ago when Rev came out, and a lot of people felt like it was too clunky and too limited unless it got weapon swap. I'm seeing sort of similar discussion points coming up with this global cooldown thing on the Weaver, even though really they're very different systems. Another thing people have been desperate to talk about, it seems, and this has happened on all the Elite Specializations, but I really, again, don't care too much for, is sword damage. And people are saying, oh, it hits like a wet noodle, it's not strong enough. I think for stuff like this, guys, it's just numbers. Again, what this 48-hour window was for the look, the feel, and the flavor, and the style of these things. And it's obvious that they want the sword to be able to do damage. It's obvious that they will sell more copies of the expansion if the new Elite spec for one of the most played classes in the game actually has an associated weapon that gains that damage buff. I know we can all be a bit pessimistic because of what happened with Greatsword or Necro if we're pure raiders, but I think generally speaking, if sword feels a bit weak and a bit lackluster, then those numbers will be bumped, and it's purely a thing about numbers. And so yeah, that's it really. The other not cool thing was, I'm sorry everyone, but I did forget to show off one of the Weaver skills. I forgot to show off Air Earth on Dagger, which is called Grinding Stones, and it's just 6 packets of damage. Cast them over 3 seconds and they bleed someone. So there you go, that was a skill I missed. And that's my quick little look back at Weaver based on some of the stuff that you guys said. Let's quickly move on because we've got all the classes to get through. Moving straight on to Scourge, sticking with the light armors. Something very cool that I missed in my demonstration, we talked about a little bit, and I was wrong about, and I really should tell you guys. This is the trait Transfusion. So, those out of the loop, Necromancers previously have always had something called Shroud, where they press F1 and they get an entirely new skill bar. The skill 4 for that Shroud has, on Core Necromancer, been a reasonably long-lasting packet of damage that ticks damage again and again and again and again as you siphon life from the people around you. Then when Reaper came out, we got a similar skill, again, where you get your big scythe thing and you weave it in a massive circle around you, harvesting people, putting multiple packets of damage out over time. So in Core Shroud and in Reaper Shroud, the skill 4 were abilities that did lots of packets of damage. Now, there is a trait, a Core Necro trait called Transfusion, that means each of those little packets of damage you put out actually heal allies now. Not only that, but you also blink enemy bodies to you, and you revive bodies as well. It's a really cool trait. Now, that's all well and good, but when we talk about Path of Fire and the Scourge, you'll notice that the skill 4 is no longer multiple packets of damage, it's just a big fear bomb. When you use the 4 and it fears away from your shades and stuff. Now, in my Scourge demonstration, I talked about this, and I said it's weird because Scourge has some support stuff. Transfusion is one of the coolest support things that the Necro has, and there's kind of like an anti-synergy there. It's not as strong anymore because it's only 1 packet of damage now, which means 1 media packet of healing. Yes, bodies blink to you, but is it really that good? And so I demonstrated this, and I thought I knew what I was talking about. I was wrong. So the devs did account for this, and they sort of manually hammered things in. Now, so looking at tooltips and stuff, it's a bit unintuitive, but they have fully preserved this trait and skill interaction. If you're a Scourge and you drop the skill 4, you fear around all of your shades and yourself in 1 big bomb, and then that ability stops. But Transfusion does continue ticking, heals over time, as it did before, as if the skill was still something that was putting out lots of little packets. Basically, Transfusion is every bit as strong as it was before, if not stronger. And the reason why I say that is because Transfusion on Core Necromancer and Transfusion on Reaper would only affect around you, but that actually affects around your sand shades as well. I even caught footage of it, but never noticed. If you look very closely in the background here, you'll see this random person, thank God they were stood here, and we get this great demonstration. This random person, as they walk through my shade, is being healed by multiple rolling packets of healing, just from being in my shade. That's not in range of me, that's being in range of my shade. So what does that mean? Transfusion's kind of like supercharged, because if we have 3 shades out, and each shade can heal 5 people over time, that's now Transfusion can target 15 people for the healing, at least, not the rezzing. I think the rezzing still just teleports to you and it will only be 5 bodies, but it can heal a lot more people. Or if we take Greater Sandshade, presumably if we take the Greater Sandshade trait and we take, which is Grandmaster, and we also take the Blood Magic Grandmaster Transfusion, Transfusion will heal 10 targets around us, actually, which is quite cool for in World versus World. So that is, or 10 targets around the shade, I should say. And there's interesting applications of that too. You guys realize this means that the shade can be like 1500 range away from you. It can be really far away from you and it won't despawn, and then you can pop Transfusion and you can heal people from very, very far. A bit like, again, I've made the comparison a few times, a bit like a Ventari tablet from a Revenant, or maybe a Ranger who's gone and executed a healing F2 on their pet from very far away. But there are interesting applications, and they did 100% preserve what Transfusion does. So credit where credit is due, really. Another buff of Transfusion within this context, if you think about it, is Transfusion can actually heal you now. It never used to be able to heal you because you were in Shroud and you can't take healing like that, but now you can heal yourself with Transfusion, and then that's something to think about also. Vaguely related to this, in the Scourge presentation itself also, I alluded to a comment from community members that the Scourge was a good Minionmancer spec and it had like some combos for Minionmancery stuff, and I questioned that. I said, well, I don't really see where that is because there aren't new minions you get on this elite spec. It doesn't really play with them very much. But the answers to this have become clear to me since, and I think that these people have some reasonable arguments. And again, it's very similar to the fact that Transfusion can now heal us ourselves. It's the way that the shades work. And the point is that your minions can gain access to all of these beneficial things that shades are putting out. Like, you might think of Scourge as like, oh, it's only strong when you got lots of players around it, but you can add your own minions to work along with that, right? So you do lose Rise because you don't have Reaper anymore, but you can summon a horde of minions, drop your Sand Shade, and the minions will gain the benefits of those shades. So if you're popping Barrier, if you're converting boons into conditions, your minions get those benefits, while the previous Shrouds were much more selfishly about damage that you do. I still think in the future we'll get a proper Minionmancer elite specialization, maybe a Shroud that is purely about buffing minions. We'll get that Orders of the Vampire Blood Magic ++ style thing, maybe, or Death Magic ++, I guess I'm talking about. But and I don't think that Scourge is fully in that space, but there are synergies there, and I figure I may as well mention them. The thing with PvE is a lot of people seem to not realize this. They put some tech in the game ages ago, which means if an enemy isn't explicitly targeting your minion, it does like 90% reduced damage to it. So adding Barrier onto your minions really isn't that much of a perk, at least in the PvE format, but maybe other places we'll see that there's some useful, worthwhile stuff, and that's kind of the logic behind that. Another really awesome thing about the Scourge, and particularly doing a lot of damage on Scourge that I never talked about, a lot of people were mentioning, and I really thought that it deserves to appear in a video somewhere. So again, I mentioned it earlier with the Elementalist and the Weaver, that the core specialization update we just had gave us an extra component on a full damage trait. So the Elementalist used to have a full damage trait that just did something when you take full damage, and now it has the added effect of healing on achievement swap. Same happened for Necromancer. So the Necromancer has a full damage trait which is fear when you fall, and no one ever took it, but the most recent patch, and I'd missed this in the most recent patch, which is why I didn't realize this synergy, but it also now has on it fear people when you fall, but also if you inflict fear on a foe, also inflict torment on a foe. So that's a core Necromancer thing now. And again, just like how the Elementalist Weaver one, and Arcane one seems to work with Weaver, this works really well with Scourge. Okay, so remember, when we fear, we inflict torment. So if we pick that up, baseline, and then we look at the Scourge, Scourge has that trait, which is whenever you inflict torment, inflict burning. right? And also remember how the Scourge works. If we pop our F4, which inflicts fear, it also pulses our shades F1s, which will then inflict, you know, a bit of torment on there. And if we're running Doomfire, it will inflict burn. So all of this is to say that if you run this certain trait setup and someone's standing next to your Sandshade, when you press F4, the shade will immediately fear the people next to it, which is great. And then it will also inflict torment and burning. And then because of our trait, where we get the burning on the auto, it will inflict another torment. And then also because of the other synergies, because we inflicted fear, we inflict torment. And then because we've inflicted torment, we inflict burning. And so it just goes, it's incredible. So you get these really crazy daisy chains. And wherever you are seeing that there is torment on the Necro now, you want to think again about that new Grandmaster. Another change, and I was playing with this in PvP on the Scourge, I don't think I mentioned in the presentation, but they updated Signet of Spite recently. So Signet of Spite, the Necromancer, just bombs people with a huge range of conditions, and it never used to inflict torment, but on the core update they made it inflict torment. So now that inflicts torment, when you pop a Signet of Spite under a certain trait setup, you'll not only get the new torment added on there, but burning too, and every damaging condi in the game except confusion, just with that one cast, which is very impactful and very fun, and I was playing with plenty of times. So this is all to say that the Scourge is very strong, and I think mostly in terms of community reception as well, most people agree that Scourge is probably one of the strongest that they've added. But I do want to make another point about Scourge and why I think it is reasonably well designed and maybe not as worthy of the nerf bat as a lot of people have been crying for. In fact, out of the new 9, I think Scourge is the one I've seen people calling to be nerfed more than anything else. But I did want to talk a bit about the downsides of Scourge, and I mean this in the pro column, something that's good about the design of the Scourge, because I think for as strong as Scourge is with regard to PvP settings, all of this is here, it's also very well designed in that it has a very specific place, and if you try and compete with it outside of that place, it sort of crumbles. And what I'm talking about here is counterplay in terms of ranged power damage. So the Scourge can only really summon shades kind of infrequently. It can't move them very easily. These aren't like Ventari tablets that can be swung around all over the place. They're very static. They cover specific regions of terrain. And as long as you're not standing near the shades, I think you have a massive advantage on the Scourge. The Scourge can only summon those shades within a limited like 900 range, right? The new weapon that the Scourge gets also isn't going to be extending their range too much. And also, these Scourges have lost a lot of survivability. A lot of survivability from their Shroud, and not only that, but a lot of mobility too. So these are actually incredibly immobile and incredibly squishy characters. So I think any kind of ranged pressure, power pressure, or condi pressure, I suppose, but power especially because they can't flip the power damage back onto you. They can with condis. Any of that kind of pressure, I think, will absolutely annihilate Scourges. And we've got a real rock, paper, scissors situation, which I've always liked for PvP balance personally. Not everyone has to agree with that. But I think we've got a real rock, paper, scissors thing where any strong power range spec will handily be able to deal with these Scourges. So, and there's a lot of specs like that in the game. We have longbow rangers, we have longbow guardians, we have rifle possibly Spellbreakers, but definitely core warriors and berserkers as well. And of course, guess what they've just added in this expansion as well? The Deadeye, which is also very strong in that space. So I think that that's something that people really need to consider. Maybe you can smash people in low-ranked, uninteresting, small throwaway games for PvP on your Scourge at the moment where people don't really know how to play. But in terms of actual team comps and stuff, I think that this has got such significant downsides that it's not the god amongst mere mortals spec several people have suggested it to be. I mean, hell, even with full shrouds and the mobility afforded, like on Reaper 2, Necros have serious problems getting focused down, and they need a lot of support to be able to accomplish what they do in PvP scenarios, and that's just been exaggerated by the new specialization. And I like that. I think that that's all signs of great design. Last little thing about the presentation also, I mentioned the one utility skill I couldn't show off because it had been disabled, Sand Swell. It's a blink ability that creates a portal behind you that when your allies use it, like a Mesmer portal, they gain barrier. Well, this was disabled. I just wanted to explain to you guys that apparently it was disabled because it was a raw teleport rather than a shadow step. And what that means in the Guild Wars 2 engine is that it doesn't adhere to path gridding. So people were taking the Scourge into World versus World and just blinking directly up onto walls of keeps and towers and things, and bypassing obviously all the mechanics that are there, which sucks. And I wouldn't expect that functionality to be retained in the actual release. So let's move on to the last light armor, the Mirage. So Mirage is probably the biggest discussion point of all of the Generation 2 Elite Specializations by a country mile. I'm not sure whether that's just because Mesmers tend to be very enthusiastic or very hyperbolic about the way that they view their class, but there are definitely several things to dig into on the Mirage that feel like they aren't too good right now, that feels like they need a touch-up. And it's not necessarily anything to do with tuning, but it's about fundamental design principles in the Elite Specialization that can make it feel a bit wonky. Before I go into all of that, there are some positives that I never mentioned, some fun synergies that I did want to dive into. And first of all, I wanted to talk about Duelist Deception. So remember, the Mirage is all about dodging. It's all about the new Mirage Cloak. And specifically, we want to dodge a lot to gain a lot of benefit out of that. Well, there's an obvious synergy here I never mentioned at all in the presentation. Criminal, really. And it's a dueling trait. A very iconic dueling trait for Mesmer. To me, as an early PvP Mesmer, this was used consistently all the time, but when Chronomancer came out, things changed a little bit. But I'm talking about Duelist Deception. So if you don't know what this is, it's a trait that means whenever you dodge roll, you generate a clone. And that's very cool, but now let's put that in the context of Mirage. Remember, especially, that Mirage has a Grandmaster called Infinite Horizons. And Infinite Horizons is that whenever you dodge, you share Mirage Cloak to your illusions. And if they're clones, they get access to ambushes. So to tie all of this together, it strikes me, and maybe someone can confirm or deny this in the comments if it doesn't work, it strikes me that if you use these two traits together, couldn't you dodge roll, create a clone, and at that same moment, Mirage Cloak that clone as it comes out so that it instantly ambushes? What this means would be that on every dodge roll, you're creating, for that moment, invulnerable clones that ambush your foe right on creation. That sounds freaking awesome, and especially when you look back at some of the ambushes and the playstyles that are available here. If those clones are, say, sword clones, and then they jab in and they do their little interrupts, that means you get interrupt on dodge on a slight delay, and then that can proc maybe things like power block and stuff. I think that's a really, really fun combo, and maybe people can confirm if that works or not. The bad world to live in would be that you dodge and it creates the illusion, but the clone doesn't gain your Infinite Horizons until the next dodge roll afterwards, and then it doesn't ambush until afterwards, which sucks. But the idea of dodging to create already ambushing clones, that's fantastic, and I should have shown that off. I should have thought of that. Another thing I want to talk about with Mirage is I really want to drive home how much I enjoy the design of this in terms of how much it plays with dodge. And there was a lot of this as well with Daredevil, but I'm really feeling the build craft opportunities that are opening up, especially on Mirage. I want to drive home how ludicrous this gets with a lot of endurance generation. Getting those, especially under an Infinite Horizons playstyle, getting those ambushes on every dodge, and the idea that dodging doesn't even cancel your regular damage rotation and capabilities and things that you're doing in the fight from a PvE context is wild. And so it really got me looking quite excitedly at different endurance generation stuff. So you got stuff like Bowls of Orion, Truffle, and Meat Stew. That's 40% increased endurance generation. It caps there 100% more, by the way. But so you get 40% more from that. You've got Vigor, obviously, that's incredibly potent. We've got Guardians that give 15% higher endurance gain to allies that are around them when they trait for their F2 to be a little bit stronger. And there's even, as well, when Mirage comes to the game, and I like this as well, another more pronounced dimension to weakness. A lot of people don't realize this. They just think of the glancing blows and stuff. But the condition, weakness, actually halves your endurance generation as well, or 50% slower endurance generation. So that as well is going to be something you're thinking about a lot more when you're a Mirage. Not that people don't think about it already, but that's another facet to all of this stuff that I really like. And I think I should have talked a bit more about in the presentation. One final thing that the community has been talking about that I don't know whether it will get nerfed. I'm not sure. I'm kind of on the fence. But Mirage is, funnily enough, and you're not going to believe me when I say this, but Mirage is, as things are currently set, looking to be the highest mobility elite specialization, the highest mobility build in all of Guild Wars 2 that has ever existed. Mirage is the fastest, that can travel the furthest over the longest period of time. So how can that be, Winner Potatoes, you ask? How can it compare with a Daredevil that has all the Thief Blinks and also can get, you know, the Snake Dodge where they move forward very quickly and permanent swiftness and so forth? I'm thinking about the Mirage right now, and it really doesn't even have that much. So there's a funny kind of like broken interaction going on here. with a toy in the game. So long-term Guild Wars 2 players will know about this. But when Halloween comes around, guys, and remember, Halloween will be launching sometime just after Path of Fire. When Halloween comes around, there's an item that gets sold in the gem store called the Executioner's Axe. And it's a costume brawl weapon that has on its skill 2 an ability you can hold down and it charges you a long distance. And you can cancel the animation right at the end. It's on a 2-second cooldown. So you can cancel the animation at the end and then do it again, and then cancel and do it again. And so every 2 seconds you can charge. Any class can do this. Any class can wield the Executioner's Axe, and this has been a staple tool for any really serious players for many years now. Well, here's a funny thing about the Executioner's Axe. It is still functioning like many old 2012 to 2013 abilities in that as a movement skill, it respects the baseline movement speed of the player that uses it at the time they use it. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if you are crippled and you use the Executioner's Axe, the Executioner's Axe will only take you 33% of the distance, or whatever the reduction of movement speed cripple gives you. If you are chilled, it will make you move less distance. If you are crippled and chilled together, it will make you move barely any distance. All movement skills in Guild Wars 2 used to be like this, until the devs threw in a patch that took all of that away and standardized things. But what's interesting is that abilities like this, that still have this interaction, they don't just work for movement impairing effects, but they also work for movement enhancing effects. So if you have swiftness and you use the Executioner's Axe 2, you go further and faster by a long way. And especially if you have super speed, you go much further and much faster. Now, let's take all this information back together. The Mirage can gain super speed on every dodge on demand. It has the in very short bursts, but all you need is to have the super speed right at the start of the Executioner's Axe, and you will gain the full benefit of it. So Mirages can theoretically just dodge for super speed, use the 2, and charge. And then they can dodge for a tiny bit of super speed and use the 2, and dodge for a tiny bit of super speed and use the 2, and they can supplement with that blink as well. They can turn around for quick little phase retreats. They will be, if this all works out by the time Path of Fire comes out, the fastest elite specialization. They will outrun anyone and anything, which is very funny considering this another key feature of this expansion is mounts. A lot of people have been talking about that, and so that's pretty fun. I will also note something I thought of too, with World versus World in mind, is siege golems also very much enjoy super speed, and I wonder then if a Mirage in a siege golem can just do little dodge rolls while they're in their golem to speed themselves up massively. That could be a fun little synergy too, unless while you're in a golem it disables traits. I'm not much of a World versus Worlder, so I'm not entirely sure of that. Maybe someone can comment on that down below. So let's talk about some of the downsides, what people have been complaining about with Mirage. Now, there's a huge laundry list. I'm not going to be able to get into all of it. We're already half an hour into this video, and we've got the other armor classes to do. But a couple of things I did want to talk about, a bit more specific to me. Specifically, a comment I made on the video that I don't really stand by, and the more I think about it, the more I'm like, yeah, I was probably wrong to say that. What can I say? It was in the middle of a ton of other videos. But I described the Mirage as a breath of fresh air because it was a heavy Condi playstyle. Now, the reason I said that, which I do think is perfectly valid, is that the Chronomancer has nothing to do with Condi, and I've always felt that the raw Mesmer lines aren't very good for Condi slants. Like, we do have Condi traits, obviously, and there have been Condi capabilities, but it's never really shone to me. And so the idea that we get something that's very directly focused on that, and there are lots of different components that all build towards a Condi playstyle, I do think that that is a strong thing for the Mesmer to finally get, but it's kind of a weird comment to make, considering how much condition play Mesmers have been having anyway in the last 2 years. So Chronomancer, let's be clear, has nothing to do with Condi. Chronomancer is not a Condi elite specialization. It really doesn't care about it. Chronomancer is simply incredibly strong and buffs the capability of everything else that Mesmer can do. And it just so happens that in the past 2 years over Heart of Thorns, there has actually been quite a lot of Condi play anyway. And that's for a variety of different areas. In PvE, with big raids, we've seen a lot of Condi stuff going on with the duelists and so forth. You get to ramp a lot of bleeds up on people, but especially in PvP, right? And I've done much of this myself. Some of the these seasons that have gone, I've played almost purely Condi Chrono. I've played, Christ, hundreds of games of Chronomancer over the Heart of Thorns days, and yeah, they've been Condi builds. Really, it all centers around just a couple of small interactions where they start pushing their Condi damage out. But yes, there has been a lot of Condi Chrono play. And so then for me in the presentation to say, oh, it's a breath of fresh air playing Condi, under the context of the way Chrono has been utilized for the last 2 years, is a bit of a stupid comment. I think there's some validity in the core of what I was trying to get at, but hey, it was a minor comment in the middle of a lot of other stuff, and there you go. So some of the other problems that the community has mentioned with Mirage, and again, there are a lot. I mentioned this in the video, but the idea of shatters not working well enough, maybe I could have driven home a bit more. Again, it wasn't meant to be balanced feedback, so hey, but that seems to be a really big thing in the community. People don't like how much you are really reliant on shatters as a Mesmer and how bad it feels to shatter as you're a Mirage. So one great example of how unintuitive and weird this feels. You, as a Mirage, gain Vigor on shatters, and I mentioned this feels a bit like Tall Belt Engies, and that's fine, that all works. You can see why they did that. But if you think about it, really, if you're running an Infinite Horizons kind of playstyle, you dodge and dodge to trigger some ambush skills, and now you've got no endurance, so you want vigor. So you shatter to get vigor so you can get endurance, and now you go to dodge, but you just shattered and you killed all your stuff. And don't forget, this isn't like being a Chronomancer where your stuff's getting resummoned for free now. You've got to regenerate that stuff now, and so I can kind of see some of those unintuitive things there. I mentioned the Greatsword ambush, which actually seems to scale terribly with power, and it feels really clunky. You even got to see that in my video. I also made a mistake about the staff ambush, by the way, which doesn't bounce. It just sort of cleaves 5 targets. I read the tooltip as bounce and just winged it, but it was actually just a cleave through. I think I would have preferred that as a bounce, but hey, there you go. We also have mirrors, and mirrors are really the last kind of real core issue, or as I see it, for Mirage, that's not something that can be explained by tuning. I think a lot of the community see tuning issues and don't quite have the imagination to see how that could work under a different number setup. But definitely mirrors. I think mirrors don't really work, right? Like, if the idea of this is to enable you to be a little bit more deceptive some of the time, and sort of dupe people a bit more, who's the clone kind of thing, it's then very weird to bundle into the Elite Specialization this pickup system where you are easily identifiable because you have to run over to the mirrors to proc them. And it doesn't matter how strong they make picking mirrors up become. You know, they can really increase the duration on the Mirage Cloak. They can make the effect on it do a lot more. It doesn't matter how much they change that and chop and change it. That fundamental thing of, okay, the Mirage is going to be clearly walking towards their mirrors. Is that right for the spec? You might argue it's a bit like with the Deadeye, where they've built in a little bit of counterplay for other people, so it's not too frustrating. So this is an opportunity for your enemies, and it deserves to be there. But those aren't the kind of opinions anyone can come to in just 48 hours, in my opinion. So there you go. That's the Mirage. That's light armor. Let's move on now to the mediums. First, let's deal with Deadeye. Much like with the Weaver, where perhaps it was excusable and I missed an ability, I actually missed an ability on Deadeye too, and it's much less excusable on Deadeye because it has way less to it. I forgot to show you guys the flip-over skill, the stealth skill, the ambush skill for the rifle, because don't forget, we are a thief, so when we're in stealth, our auto-attack will change to something different, and it's really important as well for the rifle. This is what builds Malice, okay? So this is something, I believe, that gives you extra chunks of Malice as you execute it, and I never showed that ability off at all, so there you go. Let that be me rounding that video out there. I also made a little bit of a mistake about the strength of one of the Grandmasters. So remember, we have a Grandmaster that increases our maximum Malice. And it mentions in that Grandmaster that this also buffs our Grandmaster Minor, which is that when we hit max Malice, we gain a ton of boons, remember? And I said, okay, so now that one that gives you a ton of boons also has a heal on it, and they've probably done that to compensate you for the fact that you get there slower. But don't forget that the trait that increases our Malice capacity also increases the speed that we get it. So I mentioned, oh, it would be harder to get to, so we get this heal as a compensation. It's not like that at all. It's just straight up buffs because we get the increased Malice generation anyway, and it takes about the same amount of time. So do think about that. Then also, I didn't mention some fun interactions as well with crouching down on the rifle. So I mentioned that you can dodge left, right, forward, backwards, and in the diagonals, and that's actually a little bit of movement for you. But also, and I also mentioned that you can blink around. So if you are crouched and you use Shadow Step, or if you are crouched and you throw the Shadow Orb, then that will move you. But also, movement utilities also work. So if you're looking at things like Withdraw, the heal skill, and some people laugh at Withdraw, but it's found its way into various areas of the game over time. If you look at Withdraw, or maybe the much more useless kind of Roll for Initiative, these abilities will still function while you're crouched down, and I never mentioned any of that stuff. I do think that the Deadeye and how immobile it can be is something. It's going to be a little bit like the global cooldown for the Weaver stuff, in that players will hear about it on paper, and it's only until they get to play it and truly experience it that they'll feel how limiting it can be. But generally speaking, those are some extra interactions that can help you out there. Another issue with my presentation was the way that stolen skills work while you're on the Deadeye. So let me just be very clear. These abilities only work for as long as your target is marked. If you kill that marked target, you will lose the ability. If you mark a different target, you will lose the ability. And that is why they can afford to be a little bit stronger. Obviously, they're also on elite specialization, so they can be stronger. But that is a specific interaction you need to focus on. And I just really hadn't been clear enough about that. Aside from that, I'm not sure really there's too much more that I can say about the Deadeye. I haven't seen much of a community response of things that I may have missed or really interesting stuff. Of course, there are going to be fun builds and things I haven't shown you guys yet, and a lot more to talk about, but I think for the most part, we've been comprehensive enough. It's a very specific thing and a very specific playstyle, and I think you can cover that in the amount of time we had. So next, medium armor. Let's move on to the Holosmith. So yes, everyone, I do understand it's a lightsaber that this thing is using. The amount of people that seem to only like the spec because it essentially gets a lightsaber is crazy to me. The pull of Star Wars geekdom is way stronger than I perhaps had anticipated before. I never even mentioned that in the presentation, and yes, it's true. That's basically what it seems to be designed to mimic and look like. So here's some other fun things and interactions that you guys might not know about the Holosmith, and I didn't talk about in the presentation. Remember how when you overheat, you take a big explosion of damage, and then you do lots of little ticks of damage? That big explosion when you overheat, you can actually dodge. So that's even more play. When you are a Holosmith and you feel that you've built your heat to a very high degree, you can dodge and predict exactly as that would land to save your own bacon. Now, heat comes in as you attack and use the base skills, generally, so you'd have to get right to like 99 out of 100 heat, then not use any skills and let it passively push you to 100 in the middle of a dodge roll. So it'd be quite hard to do as far as I can see, but that is a thing. Another fun playstyle opportunity for the Holosmith that you guys might not have seen, I never mentioned on the presentation, is to do with might. So there's a lot of might in Guild Wars 2 at the moment. The Holosmith is no stranger to this, and one of the Grand Masters actually enables you to have 25 might constantly, with very little finessing of your skill bar. Like, lots of characters and builds can get to 25 might these days, but the Holosmith does it very, very easily, and it's through the trait that gives you 150 heat capacity instead of just 100, because remember, when you're in these higher echelons of heat, that Grandmaster also gives you might. And built into that Grandmaster then is the opportunity for a Holosmith to just push their heat up. And this can be done out of combat even, right? You can just push your heat up and just stick about over the 100 heat threshold, and you'll just roll to 25 might, and without really having to use any skills or anything, as long as you maintain that general heat level, you're just running around on 25 might. It's not quite as cool as you might first think. Remember, there's another Grandmaster that means you never lose heat. So couldn't you just do both of these together and just permanently forever have 25 might unless someone strips or flips it? How cool would that be? But don't forget, those are two competing Grandmasters, so the devs have quite sneakily figured out a way to stop players doing that, but that's a very easy 25 might thing that many people mentioned, and I thought I would say. Something much more interesting to me, perhaps, is one of the other traits, Crystal Configuration Storm. So this is the one that buffs your Holosmith mode auto attack out the ass and makes it super strong. One interaction I never talked about is that when you buff it, it actually turns your autos not just stronger and like projectiles and stuff, but it turns them specifically into explosions. And so as explosions, that then unlocks all of that synergy with the core explosives line. It means you get access to things like shrapnel and the extra damage and so on and so on. So that is really awesome. And I never had noticed there that there was such a strong tie back into core engineer by picking this Holosmith trait and getting access to more explosions while you're in that mode. And then one of the other cool little things, I guess, that I heard after doing the video is that one of the traits, it's called Laser's Edge, is clearly a reference to that story thing, Razor's Edge. So there you have it. Looking at some of the less cool things, community response, I think generally people have agreed that the sword doesn't feel that great. It doesn't have too much interesting about it, and it feels a bit limp. But here's the biggest thing I think a lot of people are looking for on Holosmith, and I wholeheartedly agree, and that is getting heat benefits on other weapons beyond just sword. So let's think back. Remember, the sword auto attack and the 2 and the 3, they all get extra crit chance if you are over 50 heat. Remember? Well, people are basically saying, why don't the other weapons get that? And you might think, well, that's a lot of work, isn't it, wooden potatoes? Well, no, hell no, it's not. Not when they've done stuff like Weaver on this generation. And we're talking about Engineer. Engineer's other weapons are these. Rifle, pistol. Shield, if you really care to count it, right? Like, it's not difficult. They have just a couple of other weapons, and if they added these onto those... So if you pick Holosmith, you get extra benefits on your rifle at certain heat levels. If they just buff those up a bit, I think that opens up Holosmith to do a lot of other fun stuff. Like, some of these Holosmith traits are vaguely Condi related, and we know they don't want it to be a major Condi thing. It's definitely more of a power thing, but there is some Condi on there, and well, if the pistol got some benefit from heat thresholds, then maybe we could use a proper Condi weapon on the Holosmith and get a bit more benefit from those burning traits and things, just for people who are interested in that playstyle. So I think that that is probably some of the most concise and good feedback I've seen from all 9 that would be very nice for Holosmiths. And it's not like it's a huge ask, is it? Maybe there's a design reason they didn't do it, but if there is, it's eluding me. And so for the last light armor, let's talk a little bit about Soulbeast. So first, I've just got to say, I think my coverage was a bit crappy on that one. The Weavers, the Elementalists out there, had the advantage of the first video I made was that. So I was quite happy to go for like an hour and a half. It was actually like an hour and 40 minutes of just raw recording, and then lots got cut out in the end. But by the time I got to Soulbeast, which had an equal amount to deal with, I was starting to get pretty fatigued because I had such a small window to cover the stuff in. My original plan was to show off every single pet and merging with every single pet and mousing over it all. But by the time I got to the video, I thought, I guess I won't do that. So I do apologize there. But there's a more important thing that I missed on the Soulbeast video that really was quite bad, and that's that how many interactions there were with other ranger stuff that affects pets. So there's a ton of stuff. It's not just about using weapon skills that then gives your pet extra effects that then when you're in beast mode you should be getting. But there's an enormous number of traits, utility skills that have stuff like this. So I want to talk especially about Sikkim. Because this is very strong. I did demo this on a stream, but it felt a bit inconsistent and weird, so I didn't want to talk about it too much. But just so that you guys know, the Ranger has access to a shout where when they pop it, they gain their pet gains extra movement speed and extra damage. The extra damage their pet gets is 40%. A 40% damage modifier. That is the single largest modifier that is on anything in Guild Wars 2, except maybe when we start looking at the rifle on the Deadeye and stuff like that. That's a huge modifier on everything that the pet does. Now, supposedly, when you're in beast mode, if you're running Sikkim, you get that. So all of your stuff becomes 40% stronger, and that works on top of all of your traits and stuff. So it's that strong, and the movement speed should be on there. A lot of that stuff seems really potent. Don't forget, too, that when a Soulbeast merges, if they trait properly, they become unblockable. So you can be unblockably charging around doing 40% extra damage. Some of these synergies are wild. And then you've got other things like Guard, which means that your pet taunts, right? And your pet takes half damage from allies around it. Well, if I'm in beast mode and I use Guard, does that mean I start taking half the damage that my allies would otherwise, and then it's getting reduced? Like, there's loads of fun little synergies, and I really regret that I never gave you more of that on the Soulbeast, because it truly is as deep as Weaver or any of the others, blow for blow, if not more so. So some little broken things as well. I don't know whether they're right for the game, might get changed, but of course the pet is an entity that can die. The Soulbeast, as it currently stands in the demo, could still merge with their pet even when it was dead, which already is very strong, and I think shouldn't be there. I think the idea of a pet being killable is important for counterplay on builds like this, and if you kill the pet, it should come at some cost to the Soulbeast. But no, if you kill a Soulbeast pet right now, he can just merge with it and continue rampaging. Even worse, though, or even better, depending on your perspective, I suppose, when the Soulbeast demerges with that dead pet, it is resurrected. So I had several people tell me about this as well, and that seems crazy. So it means that, you know, if you kill both ranger pets and their pet swap's supposed to be in really long cooldown, that should be a benefit to you if you've spent that long focusing the pet instead of the player. But no, the Soulbeast will just merge and then demerge, and not only will it still get super buffed, but the pet will be back alive very, very, very soon. Then there's some other weird things, like what if when we go down while in beast mode, Can we then, like, lick our own wounds and stuff like that? I guess when we go downstate, it strips of us of all active effects, so we're not technically in beast mode anymore, and that wouldn't work. But, yeah, lots of fun little things to look at with the Soulbeast. I also mentioned in the video that stance that gives you boon duration. And I said, hey, can anyone tell me what attribute number that is? Yeah, that's 990 concentration on a single utility skill. 990 concentration you can share to your allies. 990 is more than you can get running full ascended concentration-based gear right now. Because there's no concentration major stat stuff right now. So what you get with any full concentration stuff is 663. From all your gear, from all the money you spend on gear, is only 633. You pop this utility and you get 990 for the duration. That's how strong that is. So speaking of stances, I think another big thing of community feedback that I very much agree with here is the way that the stances work. Now, you could see it in the video where I talked about it. I said to you guys that I thought the stances looked weak, but as soon as I started looking at them in conjunction with the Grandmaster, they felt strong. Well, that's kind of bad, right? I think that if the stances are balanced so that they are deliberately, like, weak so that they can exist in a shared world, then that kind of sucks. You shouldn't have a full branch of utility skills that just feels rubbish if you don't have the Grandmaster. I think they should get something like the Venoms treatment that Thieves had eventually, where Venoms were deliberately reduced in efficacy because they knew that they could be traded. So in the end, the dev said, all right, let's just make it baseline, and then that gives people a bit more freedom with their traits. I think that that should be going on with the stances too, but I don't know, the whole thing's a bit weird because, again, Ranger is already a class that is loaded with so many unique buffs, and Soulbeast just got 6 more of them. 6! It's crazy. And last but not least, let's deal with the heavies. Christ, we've been already talking so long. I'm sorry if the heavies get a little bit of a cop out here and not so much discussion. But let's talk first of all about Renegade. Renegade's very interesting to me. It just so happens that in regular Guild Wars 2, not to do with the expansion right now, but I've started playing a lot of Condi Rev. I've been having a lot of fun on Condi Rev, and I've learnt a lot about Condi Rev, which is nice because the Renegade is all about improving Condi Rev playstyles. And now that I have that knowledge in hand, there's something that's struck me quite curiously about the design of Renegade that maybe you guys didn't notice. And that's one of the legend summon abilities called Ice Razor's Ire. So, condition damage revenants who run the Malik's specialization, they get a trait called Abyssal Chill. It's a new trait that came into the game. It's very fun. And what it means is whenever you apply chill to a foe, you also inflict 2 torment. It's a lot like what Reapers get, except where Reapers are doing it on chill into bleed, we're doing chill into torment. And so that's a really fun trait for Revenant, I find, because Revenant has limited access to chill, while the Reaper has tons of chill, and so the trait is Grandmaster and super build defining. On the Revenant, it's like you only have a few applications of chill anyway. Like, you've got Unyielding Anguish on Malik's, you've got your sword too, but you're probably not running much sword anyway because it's not a proper Condi weapon, and maybe a couple of other little places. But beyond that, you're then looking at Sigils of Hydromancy and kind of ignoring Abyssal Chill, and it's not that strong, or you're looking at combo fields. So then when we look at Renegade, Renegade is all about inflicting condis, and yet Renegade doesn't have anything at all which inflicts chill. And that's quite curious. Renegade's much more about burning, and it does have a lot of condi. It's got, you know, lots of bleed on there too, which Core Rev had less of, so it starts to pick up that side of things. But you would have thought the devs would have added a bit of chill onto the Renegade so that it has those fun synergies on a core specialization, but they just deliberately didn't do it. And it's weird, though, because when you look at one of the legend abilities, it's called Ice Razor's Ire. And what does it inflict? Cripple. Cripple is really weird because there were early dev comments that Cripple wasn't really something they wanted on Rev, and obviously those boundaries start breaking down when you get to Elite Specialization, so I don't think they're by any means beholden to that. But if that was their baseline going into this, and they knew they had Abyssal Chill, and they knew they had an ability called Ice Razor's Ire, why wouldn't they put chill on it? So it strikes me that maybe they did have chill on it once upon a time, but before we got our hands on it on the demo, they decided that it was too strong for the amount of packets that it was putting out, and they instead nerfed it to cripple, and now it's like this weird oddity that we're only seeing the very end of the story. But that's been a funny thing to look at. Some other interesting stuff to do with Renegade. I think that the Elite is very fun. It's really curious to me that that Elite doesn't have an interval or an internal cooldown on it where you steal life, while the Soulbeast Soulbeast has an elite that's almost exactly like that when it's traded, but it does have an interval. I think the discussion there isn't so much why is Soulbeast so much worse than Renegade elite for elite, but instead why do we have two elite specializations presenting essentially the same elite to us. But for the Renegade one, especially, I love the idea of not having an internal cooldown on it. I love how strong it seems, and I love how it affects buildcraft, and having some kind of group composition that runs purely fast-ticking packets of damage. So Tempest with Dagger Warhorn, right? Necromancer, Warhorn in general. Necromancer Warhorn seem really strong. Ranger Warhorn seem really strong. The Mad King runes I talked about. But there's lots of other little things in the game there, guys. Engineers with flamethrowers and anything that drops multiple rolling AoEs. But then also think about Guardians who do great burst, and they do burst through lots of little packets of damage. What if they were comboing right at the perfect time that this Renegade popped their elite? And then but there's bundles and things in the game as well. Who remembers the Angry Bees, a Queensdale bundle item, which when you throw on a target, it ticks lots of little bits of packets of damage on a target for like 30 seconds. There's synergy there with this new Renegade elite where you can have everyone throw bees at the boss right as you pop the elite, and then he's getting hounded. What about when we think of PvE, actually buffing random NPCs in the area with this as they swarm foes and go into big crunches? Remember, it's a bit like I was saying with the Scourge and minions gaining the benefit from barrier and stuff. Well, it's just random NPCs and things potentially can gain the benefit of that elite there too. And so that's all very fun, and I'm looking forward to Renegade for some of these reasons, though a big part of me thinks we'll probably see an interval go on that in the end, and it will make me very, very, very sad. So, let's talk about some of the less cool things about Renegade. I already talked about no synergies for Abyssal Chill. In a weird way, by the way, I kind of like that there's less synergy, because it means that Revenants and Renegades, both really, are looking for ice fields a lot in order to do combo finishes. And, you know, you got the Longbow, that Longbow 3, they're all combo finishes, 20% chances, so maybe there's some fun stuff there. But let's look at some of the really bad stuff. I focused a lot on energy on the presentation, but the spirits, I think, have a much worse problem even than energy, which I never talked about at all. And this is the way they function in terms of being allies of yours. They're not Ventari tablets or shades. They are more like phantasms. They're stationary, unmoving phantasm. What this means is that they can be killed, which means that they lose their effects, and they're pretty squishy, and also, even worse, that they can be crowd controlled. Anyone who plays Guild Wars 2 since Heart of Thorns came out knows that if you don't have stability, and you go into a great many contexts in this game, a great many, even PvE, if you look at the way that dinosaurs and saurians and stuff charge around and all of that kind of stuff in the jungle, there's a huge amount of CC. If you don't have stab, you are going to get interrupted a lot, especially in PvP and World versus World. It basically means that these spirits, they get some... If you want to drop them onto a node to swing a team fight, for example, it's not going to do anything because they're going to get immediately interrupted and they're going to do nothing. And then moments later, they're going to be dead because they are just not sturdy enough. So I think that really the decision on the devs' end to make these actual spirits was a terrible one, unless their potency and their power is majorly buffed to the point that we want to counter them, and they start feeling a lot more like engineered turrets. It would be like Turret Spec 2.0. But where turrets were incredibly passive and unfun before, at least when you're fighting a Renegade, they can only have the spirits up for a certain amount of time before they legend swap, and then, especially with the Elite, for example, the upkeep, it's going to be going away. I never checked that either, by the way. Do the spirits despawn when we legend swap, or do they stay? I'm not entirely sure on that one, and that seems like that should have some profound effects for the way that the spec works. So I kind of like the idea of these things being CCable or damageable and stuff, but I think there should be traits that make them sturdier, give them stacks of stability that refresh, or, you know, their baseline power should be increased to compensate for such a major downside. And right now it is a very real problem, and unfortunate, because the entire legend is revolving around those. Another big problem as well is the heal skill. So I mentioned that this was a really interesting heal because it's a stun break, and I think I am more confident saying this right now. I don't think there's a single stun break heal skill in all of Guild Wars 2. So Rev can get away with having this because they get 2 heal skills at once, so it does get away with it a bit. But what you got to understand about Guild Wars 2 abilities, right, is if you get interrupted in the middle of the cast time for something, any heal in the game currently, it will go on a small cooldown, but not the full cooldown. But if that ability has already given you a beneficial effect of any kind as soon as you click it, then it will always go into full effect. So I'll give you an example here. on Elementalist, you have this skill called Ether Renewal, which you channel, and it's constantly cleansing conditions, and it's constantly healing you. If you get interrupted in the middle of an Ether Renewal, it will go on full cooldown, just because you will have gained some benefit from it already. The condition cleanse, or the initial pulses of healing. Basically, they have to do that so that you don't feel rewarded for being interrupted, so that then you can immediately start healing again and cleanse even more or whatever. So the devs have always had heals and any ability function this way, and that makes sense. But when you look at the Revenant stun breaking heal skill, what this means is if you pop the heal just to heal, not to stun break or anything, you're not CC'd, you're just trying to heal, and someone interrupts you in the middle of it, the game will read that as you've already gained a benefit from it, the stun break aspect, even if it was wasted, and it will always go on full cooldown. Always. So it's incredibly vulnerable to interrupts. And this isn't like Shelter on the Guardian, where you're blocking during the cast of it, and Revenant really doesn't have any access to putting that kind of defense in front of them. And so, yeah, it's a real downside. The other big issue here, and again, this is not so bad because you get 2 heals on Rev, but quite often, if you get stunned, you might be stunned at like 90% health, but your only stun break is the heal. So you pop the heal for the stun break, and then you're wasting the heal part of it. And then you start taking damage, but your heal's on cooldown. So it really does feel very clunky and weird, and I'm not sure how they can fix that. I do think that that's still in the world of tuning and not totally broken as an interaction. I just think they need to sort of shore up its defenses a bit so that it feels like it's a bit more workable. So that's another problem. And then lastly, I think the other thing I've seen the community really struggle with on the Renegade is underwater stuff. You know, Rev is already a class that hasn't had too much use out of underwater or love underwater. And I don't think Renegade really did very much at all for underwater aspects of the class, which is a real shame considering all the pet merging stuff and the underwater ambushes and underwater dual attacks that we've seen on the other specializations. And they seem to have got the short end of the stick again, which is very unfortunate. Moving on, let's talk about Firebrand. Some stuff I missed there, some important bits of feedback. First of all, I mentioned the idea of a perfect stat set that's Condi damage and his healing and his concentration. Yeah, Seraphs. I mean, I knew that Seraphs was going to be good for Firebrand, but it is exactly perfect for Firebrand. So it does seem pretty strong, and I would recommend you guys get into Lake Doric to start working on that. Reading the room, it seems like it should be great. The burning was obscene that I already showed off in that video, but something else that's really interesting, and I didn't show you guys, is I didn't go to the AoE golems properly and show it off. So why this is important is because I think it's Radiance. Radiance Guardians get a trait which means they're passive on their F1, which means when you burn everyone around someone. That triggers more frequently. And what that means is when you take that trait and you go into an AoE setting, the burning starts bouncing and rippling through the targets you're fighting very profoundly. It's really strong. And so that all exists on Core Guardian, and you could sort of play into it a bit with Staff 1 autos before. Well, now they kind of rein Staff 1 auto in, maybe to improve the space for Firebrands who will be doing that on their tomes, which already baseline were burning a ton. So there is an obscene amount of burn, explosions of burn stacks and damage that I haven't demonstrated to you guys at all. I also think I really undersold how strong that pull is. The 900 range just vacuum everyone together like a temporal curtain just really easily. I think I didn't show that off well enough. And then there's another thing as well, in that there's a trait which means you can instantly refresh your F3 whenever you res someone, and I don't think I showed that off well enough considering how strong that tome is. Moving into some of the community reactions, some of the less cool things about the Firebrand, and again, as I've mentioned to people many times, I think the Firebrand, not that I dislike it, not that I think it's bad, not that I don't like Guardians, but out of all of the elite specializations, I think this one is pretty low on my list in terms of being excited about it. I think it's just a bit bland really, with like the Grandmaster that just applies a slow instead of taking some other interesting routes. But some of the things that people didn't really like. Mantras. Now, I should have mentioned this. The mantras are strong and they are interesting, but to proc the AoE component of mantras right now, it's like a tiny cone in front of the Guardian. I don't know why the devs I don't know what they were thinking when they designed it like this. There's just no quality of life on giving those mantra effects to your friends. It's so easy for them to move out of, even when you're out of combat, just trying to demonstrate the skills, let alone when you're actually fighting. So I think we'll see some quality of life and tuning improvements on that, definitely. It's one of those things 1000% I expect to be changed, but I do scratch my head where that even came from originally. Maybe they originally were much more potent and they did that limited range to compensate. I don't know. But also, if you think about the way that the mantras work, I think right now it's very beneficial quite often to just dig through all 3 charges of the mantra and the final one and go for the big recharge to refresh it all, than to portion them out. And I think that there have been a lot of complaints about the tuning there. There are also people complaining about the tome cooldowns, but I think that that's more of a philosophy thing. So this is most relevant for the F3 and the F2. F3 we can refresh under some circumstances, F2 not so much. I do think this is more of a philosophy thing. So some people basically want the tomes to be just like engineer kits, always available, dip in and out whenever the hell you like. But listen, if we move into that place, guys, if you think you like that idea, that's cool, but remember that the skills on the tome would be nerfed, heavily nerfed. The only reason that those tome skills are as strong as they are, and they are ridiculous, stab and aegis and stuff on auto tick is crazy, right? The only reason they are that strong is because inherently the Firebrand as it currently exists, you're only allowed to dip into it every now and then, unless, you know, you're running a specific damage-oriented playstyle and you're running a certain trait, right? And things are dying a lot around you. They are deliberately designed to be that way, so you would have to have them nerfed. So what we're actually discussing then is, what do you prefer? Do you want the Firebrand to have kind of more of a conjure weapon style experience where you dip into it for a bit and then you drop it and you go on, or do you want it to have a pure engineer kit kind of experience where you've got all the 3 kits constantly available to you and you're on a class with a weapon swap at that, which means you have 5 different bundles of weapon skills to ruffle through at any specific time, right? These are, I think, just going to come down to personal preference. When you really break it down, some people just want no cooldowns because it would be overpowered. But if we live in a realistic world, that's the discussion at hand here. Do you want that kit playstyle where you're constantly playing the piano as a Guardian? Do Guardians want to play the piano? Or do they want to maybe have a slightly different experience where it feels, you know, maybe like transforms as well, right? Like, they're just slightly less frequent things for us to dip into. And I guess the devs decided that the more fun one they were interested in was not forcing Firebrands to play the piano, but instead to have these just as high power things that you only dip into every now and then with very pronounced effects. I haven't played enough to really know my opinion on which way I swing for that. And definitely the elite specializations are about presenting experiences other professions have on other ones, which means that, yeah, why shouldn't Firebrands be able to play the piano? But I guess I'll have to wait a while before I really settle down on what I feel. And so last but not least, they've been last both times. I'm so sorry, everybody. Let's talk a little bit about the Spellbreaker. And I don't even have that much to say about the Spellbreaker. For what it's worth, a lot of people ask me why I left Spellbreaker as the last video. I left it as the last video because I really like it. And I thought it'd be a nice one to end on. And also the ordering was fairly arbitrary. Remember, I just did those videos back to back to back to back to back. And it didn't feel like it was going to be that long of a wait for me. In fact, it wasn't really that long of a wait. But yeah, someone had to be last and it ended up being one of the ones I was very excited about. So here's some cool interactions I hadn't mentioned. Remember how the elite is a lightning field? And I pointed out, oh, you can blast in this to give people swiftness. That's actually very strong for a different reason. And that's that if you leap in it, it will obviously make that a dazing strike. And a dazing strike on a Spellbreaker is a powerful thing. Don't forget that the dagger main hand has a leap on it. And we have other leaps, obviously, tons of them on Warrior. If you get a dazing strike, then that means you're getting attacker's insight when you land it. It means you can rip boons. You can do all of that kind of stuff on those little dazes or stuns. Which one are they? I think it's a daze as you use that light field. So I actually kind of would have liked the idea of some more of those meditations, maybe dropping light fields. But that's what's beautiful about the cross-profession combo system, right? You're now enjoying elementalist static fields and engineers that drop them and whatever because you're getting those extra dazing strikes. And that's something you want to think about as a Spellbreaker because that gives you so much strength. Here's another really fun synergy I didn't consider. So remember our heal skill? It rips all conditions of ourselves. It heals us majorly, but also, sadly, it rips all boons off of us. It's all about purity of mind. So it's a weird skill in that it takes boons off of ourselves. It takes all of our might away. It takes our stability away, our ages away. Weird idea, isn't it? Well, think about this. That action, and this was confirmed to work, that also procs Attacker's Insight. So remember, Attacker's Insight is the Grandmaster Minor. That means whenever you remove a boon, you gain stacks of power and ferocity. Well, that works on your heal skill. So what you can do, guys, is at the start of a fight, you can pop like 4 Great Justice to give yourself 3 different boons, and then you can immediately use your heal skill and start the fight with 3 attackers in sight. You can give yourself it because you're ripping your own boons. You're not even reliant on your enemy having boons because you can take your own off to give yourself stacks of that. And what a fun synergy that is. So here's another really cool synergy. Remember the Grandmaster Magebane tether? We execute a burst skill. It creates a tether between us and the foe, and it stacks might on us gradually. Well, the core balance patch had something for this too. I already did a video with Boots about this. It's a trait called Might Makes Right. So warriors have a baseline trait right now, which is where every time you gain a stack of might, gain health and gain endurance. And now we have Magebane Tether, which means if you tether to someone, you're stacking might on top of yourself, and you're stacking health on yourself, and you're stacking extra endurance on yourself for as long as that tether is in play. So that's really fun as well, and those two were clearly a match made in heaven. They were built for one another. Another thing, the elite that I didn't mention, or I was actually just straight up wrong about, I mentioned that it's 10 pulses over 10 targets, sorry. So in theory, you can rip 100 boons with it. I was actually wrong. It's not 10 pulses. It's not a pulse every second. It's a pulse every half second. So it's actually 200 boons on a perfect scenario. It's just like a supercharged null field. So, I mean, we already get the gist of what the elite is. But if we're really going to dive into the nitty-gritty, I had a lot of people mention that to me. There's actually 200 boons because it's every half second. And yeah, just another fun thing that I had thought of before but never made it into the video. Magebane Tether again. If you use like a rifle burst, if you shoot someone at 1200 range with your rifle with the burst skill, will that then create a tether that will instantly then be broken and you'll pull someone in? So if you're a rifle wielding Spellbreaker, can you shoot someone with a kill shot and drag them in after the kill shot instantly? So your kill shot becomes like a a Dragon Hunter's F1. That would be really crazy. So, yeah, as for not cool stuff, there's a lot less criticism, I think, really being thrown at the Spellbreaker. Not that there is none. All of them have been slammed in various areas from the community who have really scrutinized them. And I think that's good for a demo, by the way. I think that that really keeps the devs on their toes and makes sure that these things are implemented well when the damn thing finally comes out. But one of the biggest problems I've seen is to do with World vs. World. Now, we already know that elite skill, as exciting as it sounds right now, could also be horrible for World vs. World. But also, even worse, Winds of Disenchantment, that beautiful massive effect, that is actually being visually cold right now. So that can get popped in a team fight, and you don't even see it. And that is a very real problem, and hopefully the devs change that priority there. Hopefully for the benefit of the whole game type. And I guess we'll just have to watch closely how much boon rip and how much people don't really like or do like where the game has gone after this expansion comes out. I've mentioned before that I think Barrier sort of shores up the defenses of some of that boon rip loss, but at the end of the day, World vs. World is all about stability. And there's a lot more stability application right now because Soulbeast will be putting it out. The Firebrands have obviously got a lot as well. There's a lot of stability application, but with all this boon rip, can it stand up? I guess we'll see. And so that's it really with Spellbreaker. Oh, another thing I thought was pretty cool is the Dagger 3 and the Dagger 4 are both on the same cooldown. So you can use the 3 to incapacitate someone straight into the 4, and then you can do them, you know, that combo always comes up together at the same time every time. And there you go, guys. That's the that's spec number 9. So yeah, generally speaking, that's a lot of the stuff that never made it into presentations. I want to round out the video just with some broad comments about my views on what this wave of elite specs are like. Just some general votes on how the community seems to have responded to stuff. So first of all, if we're going to say which of the 9 is the most overtuned, I think probably my vote goes towards Scourge. I think Scourge is, even though it does have that very significant rock, paper, scissors kind of counterplay with the range power damage, I think Scourge is really looking like it's pumping out way too much, and it will probably be tuned down a bit. And then that's closely followed, by the way, by Holosmith. I think Holosmith is incredibly strong. I'm very much ready, and get ready yourselves, guys, for the next 2 years to be filled with angry engineers who are upset that they never got the Holosmith from its original demo version for very long, because I'm very sure that aspects of the Holosmith are going to be nerfed down, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they will get it, but it just does seem so strong right now. Next, if we go in the opposite direction, which is a sadder one to think about, well, what's the most undertuned elite specialization? And please don't be mad when you hear me say this, if this is your class or these are your classes, because I actually have 3 candidates, because tuning really has nothing to do with the fun and the inherent ideas behind a class that can be fun. It just means we got to change the numbers a bit. I think Renegade probably wins it for me just because of the way energy costs work right now. One of my proposed solutions on a stream recently was adding energy gain as a mechanic for revs as a that coveted missing current 6th utility skill. There could be a little bit of build dynamics there. Maybe we'll get into those discussions later. But I think the energy costs really do make it struggle, and all of its legend skills being able to be killed and CC'd, I think really does hamstring the legend. But also, I think Weaver is the tuning of the sword. A lot of people have been very angry about, and Mirage has also got a lot of discussion there as well, a little bit more on the edge, with talking about the clunkiness of it, and specifically with regard to PvP. But I think that might just be a few louder voices there. But so maybe that's where we think with that one. I think in general, if we're talking purely in flavor now, not tuning, in terms of pure flavor, which one was kind of the worst, the most bland of the lot? I think probably Mirage. And I suggested in my original presentation that people were getting this impression from it because it didn't like have an F5 and it didn't really feel that different looking, right? But I think it does go further than that. I mean, there are things they could do. A lot of people suggested, hey, why don't we get like a purple energy bar to show that the resource is very different now and it should be thought of differently. And I think that would be a fun idea. But in terms of visual effects and stuff, yeah, it seems like it's one of the more muted ones. Maybe Firebrand too, the flavor and things on Firebrand, especially when we look at the utilities, the mantras, the way we just dig through them, the animations that are on them. The fact that we never got those classic tome animations back that so many people wanted. You know, when we hear we get an elite specialization that gets tomes, I think a lot of people wanted to see the old tomes and us holding tomes in our hands, and we weren't on the Firebrand. And I think for those reasons that kind of loses points. Another best of category, which one of the 9 to me right now, first impressions, because that's what all of this is really, first impressions. I think the best traits, probably Holosmith. I think the Holosmith, and especially the way they function, their Grandmasters, is beautiful. I would love all classes to have an equivalent kind of juxtaposition like this, just like the Daredevil did 2 years ago with Heart of Thorns. In fact, you know how every core class has a 5th line, like Arcane, or like Tools, or like Invocation? I think if all of those had Grandmasters that felt like the Holosmith Grandmasters, or the Daredevil Grandmasters, that would be excellent. And so, yeah, Holosmith definitely wins out for me there. And maybe worst traits, probably we go Firebrand again from my general impressions here at the start, just because of, you know, that really weak, boring Grandmaster, and a lot of it just feels a bit, I don't know, limp to me, just a little bit. And so there you go, guys. That's my general reading of the room. That's the general way if we're going to do these little comparisons between the elite specializations. It's now been about a week since you guys have been able to play this stuff. I'd love to hear what you all thought now that you've had a bit of time to mull it over, after you've read lots of information on Reddit, on the forums, on my videos, on other people's videos, where you're feeling. I want to see lots of big walls of text in the discussion. This has been my wall of text, a verbal one that's taken over an hour to give to you, and I want to see what you guys are thinking now that stuff has settled down, and maybe some of the pessimisms have waned away, maybe some of the optimisms waned away. Let's see what you all think. I kind of de-stressed feedback on the previous videos, so let's get a lot of it in on this one. Don't just leave comments though. Also in the description you'll see I've got a link to a straw poll. People did these on the weekend. What's your favorite spec? I want to do one here for people who have been watching Wooden Potatoes and how you guys generally feel which is the best one. So click that. Thanks, guys. I hope you enjoyed, and I will be back very soon because the devs are in the middle of presenting a ton of information to us on mounts this week, which I'd love to do a proper presentation on next. See you shortly.